Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nanjala Nyabola. As you've heard, I'm a writer and a researcher, um, primarily thinking about the questions of technology and global politics, but also increasingly engaging with the themes around decolonization and coloniality and how we think through our ideas of rights and justice in the world, which is why I was very excited to chair this session to help guide this conversation. You will not be hearing very much from me. You'll be hearing a lot from our esteemed panel, who is gathered here today to explore contemporary issues, some contemporary themes in global politics, and specifically the question of Gaza and the question of coloniality through a contemporary lens. And we are anchoring our conversation in the amazing work of Mr. Aimé Césaire, who was a leading thinker of coloniality and politics and post-colonial politics, and especially whose book, Discourse on Colonialism, gives us a powerful lens through which to think about the issues facing communities in Gaza, but also in Sudan, in Myanmar, and indeed around the world, thinking about the power relationships that make some of the issues that we are contending with today possible. Very quickly, I'm just going to speak about a little bit about Aimé Césaire and this book, and then I'm going to introduce my panelists, the panelists on this conversation, and then we're just going to get into the conversation. And before we do that, I just want to remind everybody that we do have Q&A. We have a Q&A chat, so you can type in your questions if you don't want to sort of speak. We actually encourage you to use the Q&A format so that we are able to get through as many questions as possible. We've held 30 minutes at the end for that Q&A, so feel free to drop your questions in there and I will read them out to the panelists and then we'll get a response in that way. Feel free to also share on social media the conversation that's happening today. We want to get people involved. If you haven't read the book, it's available online through multiple formats because it's off copyright, so it's available pretty much if you just Google Discourse on Colonialism, you will get it. So very quickly, just by way of introduction for those who are not familiar, Aimé Césaire is Martinican scholar who was born at a time when Martinique had been and was still a French colony for several years. Martinique is in the Caribbean. And Césaire's work was really influenced by his experiences as a colonial subject. So as he was in the early 20th century, when he, like other peers, sort of went through this French educational system in Martinique, at the end of it found himself in Paris studying at some of the largest institutions some of which are still in existence today, Lycée Louis le Grand, l'École Normale Supérieure in Paris. And these were sort of finishing schools for the French bourgeois to sort of inculcate the values and the principles that would make people from all over the French colonial territory into ideal bourgeois citizens of what we'd call it l'Hexagone, the French state. Césaire was very much on board with this particular process. He was an active participant in French artistic and intellectual life in Paris. He had already established a name for himself in the Parisian intellectual set by the time the Second World War broke out. And it was in this interwar period, sort of between the 1919 and 1939, that he really started to explore Blackness, and what in French we call négritude, as a alienation from this bourgeois ideal and his relationship with this idea of France, and how the whole process of assimilation would never actually ultimately be complete for the Black subject, because racism was so deeply ingrained in the way society and politics in France were organized. And so right at the beginning of the Second World War, Césaire returned to Martinique, where he continued his intellectual work. That's where he published his first book, Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal, Notebook on a Return to a Native Land, a reflection on this double alienation that happens when you leave and then you come back, and how do you see yourself in the societies, both the one that you left and the one that you're going into. And then in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, Césaire returned to Paris as a deputy for the French Communist Party. And this is, again, another moment of critical political reflection, because now he's part of the machine of the French government, which has come through this very gruesome and brutal experience of the Holocaust and is perpetrating violence against its own colonies, dependencies like Martinique and Guadeloupe, but also on the African continent. It's a very productive period for Césaire. He's writing, he's thinking, and in 1950 puts out Discourse on Colonialism. So this is really a crucial moment in the reflection on humanism, that is European Western liberalism, this idea of the rights of man, which is very much ingrained in the French self-perception. They've come through numerous revolutions, and the Republic is strong. And there's this idea that human rights are integral to people, but people is qualified. There's an asterisk in there because there's all of this violence that is being perpetrated in Algeria, all across Africa, all across the Caribbean in the name of the colony. And Discourse on Colonialism helps us situate a question of race, a question of racialized violence in the liberal ideal. Is it that it is impossible for the liberal ideal, the Western liberal ideal, to contend with the question of race? And what does this impossibility make possible? What kind of violence does it justify? What kind of cover does it give to specific types of political action? So today we're leaning into this particular tension because we want to think about the extent to which coloniality, as discussed by Césaire, is still present in what we are seeing in the world today. We are living in a moment where the notion of human rights is everywhere. We're talking about the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is the most ratified, most signed international legal document. But we're also seeing more violence than we've ever seen, possibly in the 21st century. We are seeing outbreaks of war and interstate violence, but then we're also seeing qualification of human rights, this return of human rights with an asterisk. What changes in the landscape of global politics when we really accept the idea that human rights cannot come with an asterisk? What is it that appears different? What are the contradictions that are embedded in our notions of human rights today that are actually fundamentally expressions of coloniality, that are actually ultimately expressions of this inability of Western liberalism to think about the way in which it handles the questions of race and of gender and of all of these human with an asterisk kind of, if I could use that framing, ideas. So that's broadly the umbrella under which we're having this conversation. We are looking at Césaire as someone who is not writing about a specific moment in history, but is inviting us to think about coloniality as it shows up in contemporary issues. And we have a fantastic panel to help us get through this today. Henning Melba is a son of German immigrants to Namibia. He joined the anti-colonial movement SWAPO in 1974 and is currently affiliated with the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, and is a professor both in Pretoria, in Bloemfontein, but also affiliated with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. Yotam Gidron is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at Leuven University, whose work lies at the intersection of African history, religion, economic anthropology, and migration studies. He has written extensively about Israel's engagements with African countries, particularly in relation to the questions of migration, religion, and of course, Palestine. Dr. Tawfiq Haddad is the author of Palestine Limited, Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territories. He currently directs the Council for British Research in the Levant's Kenyon Institute in East Jerusalem. And Mohammed El-Naim is a PhD candidate of sociology who is also training to become a historical sociologist with a focus on the history of capitalism and the global reparations movement. He's the director of the Decolonial Center, which is a project of the Pluto Educational Trust, and ran a column called Black Radicals for JSTOR Daily. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to the panel in the order in which I see them, which is not necessarily in the order that I just read. And I'm going to invite them to give us some opening reflections before we get into the question round and then open up for Q&A. Without further ado, I hand over to Tawfiq Haddad to start us off. Tawfiq, over to you.
Greetings, folks. Everyone hear me well? Okay, great. Firstly, before starting, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event and to have this time to reflect, particularly at this moment. Personally, I'd also like to sort of note that even though, of course, I'm the director of the Council for British Research in the Levant's Kenyan Institute in Jerusalem, I speak as an individual when in my interventions today. I'll also say that because things are so busy here, I haven't had super amounts of time to prepare, but I've done my best to sort of compose my thoughts. I don't have time to go into, I think Nanjala has done a good job of sort of framing things around Césaire's discourse on colonialism. But I think, I mean, the first opening quotation that came from the event description, that a civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a stricken civilization, is very apropos. And in fact, it does not require one to have a PhD by any means to be able to see how the relations between the colonizer and the colonized affects the colonizing society. It comes in sharp relief in the context of events in Gaza today, where to speak of the barbarity of the policies being implemented in Gaza today as a function of the colonial machinations of the Israeli occupation, especially when they are so explicit and insistent about it, and when this comes from virtually all aspects of Israeli political society, as well as, unfortunately, large parts of its society, that it is, in fact, obvious to draw upon Césaire's frameworks and understandings and analysis, and it would be anti-intellectual not to speak of this. However, this is also insufficient to simply take, some sort of cookie-cutter approach to it. The situation in Israel, Palestine, and Gaza today is more complex, and to truly appreciate or understand the relevance of Césaire's essays and analysis, it's important to clarify several matters related to the character of the colonial project itself today and historically. Okay, here I'd like to make two general points. One, that here, drawing off the work of Israeli sociologist Gershon Shafir, who did a sort of typological analysis of the Zionist movement and identified it as not just any kind of colonial movement or settler colonial movement, but one that should be grouped within those that are eliminationist in their driving logics. It wasn't about exploitation of the native per se, although that may indeed have happened. It was closer to examples like Tasmania, Australia, North America, where the native was to be eliminated. And that was to be done for the purpose of the establishment of a Jewish state. And this was done, by the way, through the Zionist labor movement, which is also important to, so they position themselves as some form of labor movement, and through the insistence on things like Jewish labor or Jewish markets, not employing Arabs, the Jewish state, etc. And this was consistent throughout and was actually quite successful in doing that, leading, of course, from the Yishuv period, the beginning of Zionism, all the way to the Nakba in 1948, in basically eliminating good chunks, eliminating in the sense of ethnically cleansing, in the Nakba, which we saw the destruction of 500 villages, et cetera, that in the founding of the State of Israel. So at this time, revisionist Zionism was not really a particularly powerful element, even though today they are ascendant, of course. But basically, between the combination of iron fists and iron walls and Jewish labor and all these things, we have the elimination tendency is consistent throughout. That's what I'm trying to say. Although I don't want to make vast generalizations. Secondly, is the fact that the Zionist project was never a project unto itself, and in fact could not have survived were it not for its need for an imperial mother state. And of course, everyone well knows that actually Zionist ideas actually came out of Christian Zionist thoughts in the late 19th Victorian period, and that it was only actually successful once it was adopted by British imperial interests when they sensed in that through the Balfour Declaration, etc. Now, the UK, and more broadly speaking, Western access that has been the chief ally of the Zionist movement, which enabled this current within Jewish European thought to be ascendant as a supposed solution to the Jewish problem of Europe, the Jewish question, excuse me, had different ideas around eliminationism. Their general broader interests were geopolitical and geostrategic. And over the years, I mean, Balfour and the British in the early days spoke very openly about, dividing the Arab world, protecting the road to India, protecting the Suez Canal, etc. So these were the interests of the colonial imperial backers of the Zionist project. Okay, so in this context, we have this layered sense of colonialism, settler colonialism, imperialism, etc., with different actors at stake and different interests and different technologies of implementing their project. Zionists preferred the eliminationism, whereas in truth, the Western axis, because the Palestinians were part of a broader context and part of a broader Arab world, were keenly interested. The elimination of the entire Arab world or people was not possible, but they were interested clearly in keeping down radical Arab nationalism, keeping shipping lanes open, etc., with the Middle East as the key zone of transition, and therefore preferred solutions to the dilemma of controlling this important strategic region by forms of neocolonialism, class engineering, dependency, autocracy, undermining democracy over time. I'm at 5 minutes, so I'm going to move faster. Okay. Now, basically, there's a lot to say. So eventually, however, a crisis of managing the dilemma of the native arose around the First Intifada. Let's remember, the first stage, establishment of Israel actually was quite successful in the elimination of this project. In 1967, they take over OPT, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. Up until the First Intifada, it's considered a benevolent occupation. No one is even talking about it being, a poisonous project. But the dilemmas that arose under the First Intifada forced a form of compromise to emerge between the direct settler colonialist power and its colonial imperial backers, to say nothing of what it meant for the Palestinians. But here the compromise was of the Oslo Accords, which basically was an accord to implement a separation apartheidist arrangement where basically international funds and political guarantees would lead towards the management of the externalities of the conflict rather than its resolution, and to use aid, humanitarianism, development, peace building, state building, etc., the discourse of this, to erect a system that was fundamentally oriented around separation, subcontraction of security, winning time for settlements, elite formation, all within a kind of autonomy scenario that conformed closely with Israeli designs, what was known as the Alon Plan. It was also a project that relied upon sticks and carrots. The sticks was Israel, the carrots were the donors. And so there was a division of labor within this layered colonial project, okay? So it was international funds that built and paid for the apartheid that everyone has recognized, or those with basic intellectual integrity have recognized up until to the state. But it's important to emphasize here that the eliminationist tendencies within the Zionist project were never addressed, and they were never put to an end. Instead, they were given time to continue through settlement expansion, the fragmentation of the OPT, et cetera. And but the ascendant humanitarian dimension of peace building, state building, all the discourse around peace that Oslo generated was the wrapping, not quite ascendant, but was the cover that protected the Israeli colonial settler project within which it was embedded. Okay. And this time that they got was to lead towards, to destroy the integrity of the Palestinian people and national project over time within this compromise between the different wings of the colonial actors or neo-colonial, colonial imperial actors. This led to a situation before October 7th, whereby the occupied territories was divided into over 156 different islands, the largest of them being the Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip being was also the natural locality where this apartheid scenario would break down, though, because it was fundamental. The contradictions of it were so extreme because it was considered to be unlivable by the United Nations by 2017. High poverty. We don't need to go through all the misery of Gaza that pre-existed what we see happening today. And the apartheid system was most brutal there and most violent. And this reached scientific proportions. My last thing to bring it around today. Scientific proportions whereby they had reached a level of counting caloric intake of what's allowed to enter and exit Gaza. This was the nature of the humanitarianism. So with October 7th comes a crisis of both colonial wings, okay, imperial wings. Apartheid fails. Resistance did not end. Politics hates a vacuum. In this context, the eliminationist tendencies arise and pronounce themselves within the former arrangement, dramatically expressing themselves and accelerating in the most brutality that we see today. We thus see the uniting of the two policy wings of the humanitarian and the eliminationist, with the genocidal aspects ascendant. This leads today to the first humanitarian genocide, where we have food and airdrops on the one hand, and also the same actors giving this, providing bombs for an ethnic cleansing that we see very clearly happening before this.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I know I've asked you to do a lot of things in a short period of time. You've given us a lot to think about. But I am going to come back to you on some of the things that you've said, because I think there's something that we need to tease out a little bit more. I'm going to hand over now to, thank you once again. I'm going to hand over now to Henning to give us his intervention, and then we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanchala. I would like to use a few minutes to highlight the omnipresence of colonialism in the mindset and practice from a historical perspective. But let me start with Aimé Césaire, our point of reference, who stated in his discourse on colonialism that colonialism decivilizes the colonizer, brutalizes him, degrades him, to awaken him to buried instinct, to covetous violence, race hatred, and moral relativism. And he considers this as universal regression. And on another place, he observes the colonizer, who in order to ease his conscience gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treat him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal. Those are the two quotes which serve for me as a reference point, and I guess brings us all together this afternoon. Almost in parallel to Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, Césaire locates the roots of fascism in colonialism. It was the cradle of a mentality which was applied back home a few decades later, culminating in the Holocaust. Also, Raphael Lemkin, who paved the way for the Genocide Convention, made reference to the extermination strategy applied by the German Empire in its colony Southwest Africa. While there is no direct way from Windhoek to Auschwitz, there is a trajectory linking the colonial mindset of the earliest 20th century to forms of mass extinction by the Nazi regime a few decades later. This mentality has not ceased with the formal end of most physical, territorial colonial rules in occupied territories. It lives on, and we witness it daily. The onslaught on the people in Gaza evokes memories and analogies to the German colonial extermination strategy 120 years ago. Then the Ovaherero had retreated into the dry savanna of the Omaheke. It was then cordoned off by the German soldiers. An extermination order declared that no prisoners were to be made. Those seeking refuge were either shot or driven back into the Omaheke to die of hunger and thirst. Such forms of genocidal warfare then seem to be repeated now. And Germany is complicit with by taking sides of the perpetrators. A line in Paul Celan's Death Fugue comes to my mind. It says, "Death is a master from Deutschland. His eye is blue." Namibia supported South Africa's claim against Israel in the International Court of Justice. Then Germany declared to be a third party in defense of Israel. On the day 120 years after the beginning of the war in its colony Southwest Africa, with no word in remembrance of this genocide 120 years earlier. This motivated the late Hage Geingob, president of Namibia, to the following statement, I quote, "The German government is yet to fully atone for the genocide it committed on Namibian soil. Germany cannot morally express commitment to the United Nations Convention Against Genocide, including atonement for the genocide in Namibia, whilst supporting the equivalent of a Holocaust and genocide in Gaza." End of the quote. The current reference to never again by German government officials, an admonition by the survivors of Buchenwald, illustrates a perverted instrumentalization of this obligation. Adjusted to never again is now, it justifies the destruction of Gaza and indiscriminate mass killings. This misguided obsession has its roots in the trauma of the Holocaust. It translates into the obfuscation that Germans should never dare to criticize the state of Israel, equating its government with the Jewish people, even if this means acceptance of what should never happen again. Germans have the audacity to denigrate those citizens in Israel and Jews in the diaspora who are condemning the Israeli government's policy and crimes as self-hating, anti-Semitic Jews. This testifies in a tragically perverted form that colonial asymmetries, including mass violence of a genocidal nature, remain an endorsed practice. Declaring the Holocaust as singularity degrades any other forms of genocide. Such ranking claims that the Holocaust does not compare with any other forms of extermination. This betrays logic, since such an absolute statement can only be made based on comparisons. It also downplays the trauma of other genocide victims. After all, for all decimated by genocidal extermination strategies and their descendants, this has a form of singularity too. Their downgrading of experiences is not only morally despicable and dehumanizing, but another form of white supremacy. The trauma of mass violence inflicted with the intent to destroy is in every case singular. There is no European master narrative which is entitled to negotiate and thereby deny any experiences of similar importance and relevance in the history of other people. Never again should indeed mean never again. In a televised conversation with Germany's Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck, Deborah Feldman insisted, I quote, that there is only one legitimate lesson from the Holocaust, and that is the absolute unconditional defense of human rights for all. These values lose their legitimacy when we apply them conditionally, end of quote. The selectivity we are confronted with is the notorious conditionality of a white supremacist perspective, claiming the commanding heights in global asymmetric power relations since the days of colonialism and imperialism. What Aimé Césaire already categorically stated, and I would like to conclude with that quote, remains a challenge and task in the fight for humanity. Away with racism, away with colonialism. They smack too much of barbarism.
Thank you so much for that powerful intervention, Henning. And what an excellent note to end it on, to remind us that at the root of it is this bigger existential fight against racism and its products. I'm going to hand over now to Mohammed. You are next on my list. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Apologies if my voice is a little bit unclear. I'm dealing with a little bit of a chest infection, so sorry. Thank you, Henning. I think it's perfect for me to jump off of what you've been talking about, because throughout this whole nightmare that we've been witnessing since October 7th in Gaza, I've found myself periodically returning to both Aimé Césaire and Edward Said, because Aimé Césaire helps us understand this incapacity to be human, which we're witnessing. And Edward Said shows us the methods and techniques in which dehumanization actually happens. And you know, the other day I was watching Fania Salzberger, who's a professor at the University of Haifa, a so-called liberal, reminded me a lot of that quote by Malcolm X on the distinction between liberals and conservatives. He said in the case of the United States, Malcolm X preferred the wolf to the fox, because he said, actually, the fox will most likely have you on their plate. I mean, in this interview, this is someone who's, very critical of Netanyahu, etc. Some of the language she used was that, not all civilians are innocent. That what's going on in Gaza, rather than being clear-cut genocide, the evidence is clear and certain that it is quote-unquote a set of moral dilemmas that in fact Israel are the battered nation, and that in fact they're fighting against, quote unquote, the brutes of Gaza. That's the kind of language which is coming from the liberal intelligentsia in Israel, which kind of demonstrates the point of which we're at, which is really a point of no return. But of course, the liberal intelligentsia here in the UK have been similar. And one of the things about Aimé Césaire is that the way in which he writes a discourse on colonialism, he writes it in a way where he's talking to Europeans in a way that they're not used to. You know, Europeans go around and tell people that you're civilized, you have this incapacity and this incapacity. But to say that you, Europe, who have built your entire civilization on the concept of the human, are engaging in a pseudo-humanism, and that in fact, I'm going to teach you how to be human. That's the kind of feeling that's made so much of us go to Césaire. I mean, again, another television experience. I was watching Talk TV, and Talk TV is a right-wing news channel. They had a discussion and, you know, just regularly asking if ethnic cleansing might be a solution to the Gaza question. And I know the formulation that I'm using there is a bit controversial, but that's exactly what the conversation was. Should we do ethnic cleansing? Is ethnic cleansing bad? I mean, this is the kind of scenario where we're seeing in which the inability or incapacity to see the humanity of Palestinians is making even the biggest defenders of the concept of the very human being desecrate and attack that context. Now, I'm going to be slightly incendiary in the spirit of Césaire, because that's what Césaire was as well. And I'm going to say there's two big orthodoxies that are so central to what it means for European people to understand themselves as European, which need to be confronted head on. And if you look at any Zionist on the media, on TV, on the press, one of the two biggest crimes you can commit are, first of all, accusing the Israeli civil society right now of having a yearning to see dead Palestinians. The evidence, we're seeing it. The top songs that have been trending in Israel have been fantasizing about shooting pro-Palestinian protesters. We've seen the heads of government, as South Africa demonstrated in front of the ICJ, talking about the extermination of people. We've seen them call the Palestinian people human animals. But the second you say that there's not enough Palestinian blood, which will placate to what they're desiring right now, you will be accused of blood libel. The reality of the matter is that the bloodthirst which we're seeing in Israeli civil society right now has absolutely nothing to do with their Judaism and everything to do with the fact that Israel is a settler colonial project. That is one of the first things that we learn from Aimé Césaire about colonialism and the way in which, when you call those people animals, you become an animal. And we're seeing that increase to proportions unknown. The only possibility of rehumanizing both Palestinians and Israelis is full decolonization. This is what Césaire would have said. The second thing also is on the concept of relativizing the Holocaust. And Henning mentioned this and he talked about it a little bit. But in fact, the exceptionalization allows Europe to imagine and tell itself a story that post-Second World War, we became civilized, that the Holocaust was an aberration. And the deliberate silences and telling the history of the Holocausts that were imposed on the colonized people is to continue to soothe and tell themselves this story. But I'll go even a step further than that. The ideas that are now being, the boomerang effect, which we are now seeing in Europe, borrows its template from anti-Semitism. That the way in which Europe saw the Jews in the 20th century is how Europe is seeing many different groups, but also particularly Muslims. I want to tell you the context here in the UK, but we can touch on Germany as well. Here in the UK, our former Home Office minister basically quit because she couldn't criminalize the right for pro-Palestinian people to march in the streets. In the name of defending civilization, in the name of defending freedom and freedom of assembly, she sought to restrict it. The head of the Speaker of the House in Parliament prevented the SNP from pushing a motion for a ceasefire in Gaza in the name of protecting MPs who, if the Labour Party were to say no, they would be attacked. These kinds of phantasms where you do the opposite in the name of the thing that you're doing, this is what Palestine has done. And here I want to borrow a concept from Judith Butler. And she talks about how right now we are dealing with a phantasm, a phantasmic situation where in the name, and she gives an example of Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy. She says that, there's trans people are coming to come after your identity, to come after your sexuality. And in the name of creating this irrational phantasm, which is going and on the basis of defending the family, is preventing trans people from actually coming out, is actually criminalizing trans people. It's in the name of defending gender that they're preventing gender from. And this is exactly what's going on in Europe with what's going on in Palestine. In the name of defending democracy, they're removing every single stop measure which will prevent fascism from coming back to this continent right now. In the name of defending democracy, they are they're expanding the definitions of prevent. In the name of anti-Semitism, the German police officer brings out his inner fascist. What we're seeing in New Köln and the attacks, the brazen attacks on pro-Palestinian voices, the attacks on anybody who's wearing a keffiyeh. This should make Germans pause. And this is the boomerang effect that we're actually witnessing right now. It's not just that we're seeing the incapacity of both the liberal intelligentsia and the right wing to see the Palestinians as humans. It's not just that we're seeing them dehumanize themselves in the way that Césaire said. It's not just the fact that they're showing themselves perfectly capable of allowing the kinds of violence which they allowed in the colonies to continue. It's the fact that in the name of anti-Semitism, in the name of uncritically defending Israel, they are also undermining democracy. And the reason why is this. For them, democracy has become the problem. This confrontation, this situation where pro-Palestinian voices have forced them to confront with the inhumanity which was always there and latent. The inhumanity where they said the Ukrainian refugees were blue eyes and blonde hair and they look like us, but those Sudanese refugees aren't. That inhumanity, Palestine has brought that to the fore. And rather than confront the truth head on, they would rather abolish democracy itself. And so for me right now, really, the struggle for Palestinian voices, for Palestine, is the struggle for democracy. And I think that to me is something that that's the only thing that I think, that's the most important lesson that Césaire imparts upon us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Very, very powerful and insightful. And I'm going to come back to some of the things that you've just said, because I think it's super important to make these connections, how, the colonial boomerang reorganizes the societies that are projecting this violence and they're projecting these intent on other populations, but you have to reorganize yourself in order to make that possible. We're going to finish now with Yotam, who is also going to structure his interventions around what Césaire says, but you know what, I'm not going to take much of your time. I'm going to invite you to just take the floor.
Thank you. Thanks for the interventions, and thanks again for organizing this panel. It's refreshing to have, I think, this kind of discussion. Okay, for many reasons, I wouldn't go into it, but as Raga said, I have written about Israel in Africa, and my intervention is kind of focused or inspired by these kind of themes, Israel in Africa, and to a great extent, Israeli propaganda in Africa. So I think one of the reasons that discourse on colonialism resonates quite powerfully is the way in which it points to, in a sense of urgency and rage, to the deceptive nature of colonial discourse or its hypocrisy. hypocrisy, as Césaire refers to it. He raises this point quite explicitly early in the essay, but it arguably kind of animates the whole text to the end. And he writes in the beginning, Europe is unable to justify itself either before the bar of reason or before the bar of conscience. And so increasingly it takes refuge in a hypocrisy, which is all the more odious because it is less and less likely to deceive. And he notes, interestingly and briefly, that this hypocrisy is of a recent date, that it did not characterize early imperial conquests. But I think from a distance of a few generations, it seems that this hypocrisy, perhaps as many other kind of late colonial phenomena, has not only endured, but flourished to become kind of a key characteristic of post-colonial politics, which really have often been described as politics of duplicity, smokescreens, falsification, and illusion. So reading Césaire's text against the background of the war in Gaza is a useful reminder that as a state that gained its independence alongside other former colonies, but also retained its reliance on colonial powers, as has been mentioned, and methods, Israel's engagement with the so-called global South has long played an important role in its own kind of politics of duplicity and hypocrisy. So Césaire briefly mentions the Jews in one point in the text alongside other oppressed groups, although he does not make any reference to Palestine or Israel. Now, the Zionist movement, very broadly, in its early days, and that's early 20th century, attracted the sympathy of anti-colonial and Pan-Africanist thinkers. Now, the sympathy was rooted in the notion that the same ideologies and structures that enabled colonial expansion and oppression also enabled the marginalization and extermination of Jews in Europe. Beginning never fully endorsed this idea because it conflicted with the notion of anti-Semitism as a unique natural phenomenon that is destined to repeat itself in any political context. And that was a point that Hannah Arendt kind of criticized the Zionist movement about many times throughout her writing. But in any case, Israeli leaders did strategically drew upon this idea, this kind of shared brotherhood of oppressed populations, when they tried to position Israel at the time of independence and in the 50s and 60s, alongside other young nations of the so-called Third World at the time. And Africa was really a main focus of these efforts, and arguably where they were most successful as well. And this rhetoric already then had this rhetoric of Israel as a kind of ally of independent Africa was diplomatically significant because Israel hoped that a pro-Israel African bloc would allow it to undermine Arab initiatives at the UN, which already at the time concerned mainly the right of return for Palestinian refugees. And throughout the decades, if I kind of abstract history to a few sentences, Africa remained this arena that towards which Israeli leaders were repeatedly compelled whenever they sensed that their own legitimacy or their country's legitimacy was at risk. The somewhat forced language of the Third World solidarity was quickly replaced by the rhetoric of national security and liberal democracy of the Cold War, and consequently the war on terror. Then came the discourse of innovation and economic resilience of our current era of oppressive neoliberal pacification, which we have seen at play quite powerfully around the Abraham Accords recently. And in parallel, we've seen also recently the rise of Christian Zionism in shaping international discourses around Israel-Palestine. And as has been mentioned, this faith has long been kind of influential in shaping Western perceptions of Zionism, but it is increasingly becoming so in the global South in general and in Africa in particular. And what I find interesting here is that Christian Zionism, as championed by born-again elites in the continent, insists that the enlightenment, prosperity, and ultimately the redemption of African states and people kind of hinges on their uncompromising support of Israel. And this is, again, a discourse that allows it to continue kind of staging itself as a force of progress and development. All of this is to say very broadly that I think that the hypocrisy Césaire described and decried had proven to be remarkably adaptive and capable of kind of creatively reinventing itself and mutating, with the support, of course, of willful ignorance, greed, and increasingly new communication technologies. And today we see various strands of this hypocrisy coming together in Gaza as the securitized rhetoric of the war on terror and the human rights language of liberal democracy and the biblical literalism of evangelical Christianity are all invoked in different ways to legitimize this catastrophe. What is perhaps ironic, and I'll end with that, is that these colonial discourses and politics of duplicity are increasingly supporting the political program of far-right messianic Zionists in Israel, who among all the smokescreens and double talk are actually very honest and explicit about their desire for bloodshed, their supremacist ideologies, and their religiously inspired colonial aspirations. So here I think, as much as Césaire's text reads prophetic, the current moment in which perhaps taking refuge in hypocrisy is less and less necessary is maybe even grimmer than the realities he described.
Is that, I was ready for you to gear up for for a second round. Thank you so much. That I was just like nodding along. This is so, thank you all so much for your interventions. And I want to start, actually, I'm going to toss back to both Henning and Yotam and Mohammed, if you want to come on this, because I think it's something that all of your interventions touched on, which is the Africa connection. We're obviously being hosted by the Institute of African Affairs, and I think it's really important to tease out some of the things that you've mentioned. Henning, going back to the Herero genocide and the connections that, what do we lose? Rather, let's start with what do we gain by reframing the ongoing atrocities in Gaza in light of this long arc, and particularly looking at African history? What does it make visible that taking this sequence of events out of context sort of obscures? What does situating Gaza as part of this longer genealogy add to our understanding of coloniality and of the current moment?
Thanks, Nancy. I think it displays, as so many other things, the double standards of Western hegemonic perspective. The subclassification of organized violence culminating in genocidal practices, making a difference who are the victims or the targets of genocidal practices. We have a hierarchy in perspectives. And it's illustrated by another example. The Germans have admitted that what happened in Southwest Africa 120 years ago is tantamount to a genocide, but they hasten to add from today's perspective, which has a very relevant legal implication because it prevents any other colonial atrocities to be classified as genocide with legal consequences, which the Genocide Convention would imply. So that's the other issue. But just imagine for a moment, anyone would classify the Holocaust, because it was also happening before the adoption of the Genocide Convention, which is the argument. If anybody would classify the Holocaust as a genocide from today's perspective, that illustrates the hypocrisy and the double standards and the selectivity of views by or reproducing asymmetric colonial power relations and bringing back historical experiences challenges these perspectives and makes us aware that they exist. And I think that's the ultimate task, to dismantle whenever we have the opportunity how colonialism is perpetuated in today's perspectives. The colonial mindsets are still in place and functional.
Thank you so much. And I want to stay in Africa and come back to you, Yotam, and talk about this line between Christian Zionism, the African evangelical movement. And Mohammed, feel free to jump in on this as well. The evangelical movement, from the work that you've done on African relationships with Israel, what's the role of the African evangelical movement in this sort of terrain and this sort of landscape that we're witnessing? And before you come in on that, I want to remind our viewers that you can actually ask your questions by typing them in the Q&A chat box. You can find that at the bottom of your screen if you're joining from a laptop. It's one of the options at the bottom of the Zoom window if you're joining from a desktop. Yotam, do you want to say a couple of words about the evangelical movement and sort of the role that it plays in this landscape?
Yeah, I think very briefly, because in a sense, what we've been seeing for a while is kind of an increased Pentecostalization, or kind of an increased engagement of born again rhetoric and ideas and discourses, and also to a great extent, money and influence on the politics of various countries in Africa. It's not true throughout the continent, and it plays out in different ways in different places. But increasingly, these born-again movements that have, in many ways, little to do with Israel or Israeli influence, are becoming receptive to Christian Zionist theologies that have long been very dominant in the US, right? And it is US evangelical Protestant Christianity that has kind of fueled this born-again movement across Africa. And this Christian Zionist rhetoric is very much a rhetoric and a discourse of authenticity and truth, and like kind of unveiling fake types of Christianity that have been introduced in Africa by missionaries from Europe and the US. So in a sense, it's a movement of truth and enlightenment and authenticity that paradoxically, the kind of ultimate truth that it celebrates is that Israel is kind of this index of divine intention and will in our current disposition and current global politics. And because of the influence of this discourse and these personalities on kind of politics, they also have, to a certain extent, influence on both popular opinion regarding the conflict and regarding Israel, and the position of African leaders. And I wouldn't want to exaggerate it, because of course, leaders are often subject to various forces and they have their own obligations, but we've seen multiple occasions in which these things have shaped policies. And I would say that even in the ICJ case, we've seen South Africa bring the case before the court, but also the Ugandan judge, Sebutinde, voting, in a sense, the most pro-Israel kind of voting record in that case. And her position was celebrated in Uganda by influential people as kind of a moment of divine salvation, or kind of a moment that secured Uganda's position on the side of the Lord in this particular moment. So that is very broadly, I think, kind of in summary, how this movement is feeding into discourses around Israel-Palestine.
Thank you. Tawfiq, I want to bring you back in to talk about, we've grounded this conversation in this discourse on colonialism, and thinking about the connections that lie between different parts of the global majority. One of the things that is really the driving force, I think, behind the Namibian intervention is that Namibia was the second after, just before the OPT, the last territory to sort of experience this UN process of both recognizing occupation and then pushing for the end of occupation. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why Namibia feels very strongly about the issues of Gaza. But from your perspective, from where you sit, do you think that the occupied territories see themselves, and then I'm asking you to make a generalization, but would you see it as situated within this colonial narrative, or this narrative of coloniality, or does sort of the fact that we are so late into the 21st century, that we're really talking about 30 years between Namibia and Gaza today, that there's a bit of a break, if you will, or a discontinuity that happens there. Should we still be using colonial frames, basically, or, as you said, is there something else that we need to handle this properly?
I mean, of course, Palestinians see it as a, that the context is one of colonialism. And by the way, when they say occupation, Palestinians understand the word ihtilal, occupation, not necessarily to mean it in the legalistic, internationalist legal framework of it. They understand it as the Zionist conquest of Palestine that led to the destruction of Palestinian society. So it's not just the colonialism of the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem. When they speak of the Nakba, they speak of Nakba al-Mustamirra, the continuous Nakba. So this is why when I spoke to questions of speed and acceleration of, we went through the last 30 years during the Oslo period where things were slower and had a kind of guise of development, state building, peace building, even though, of course, it obviously was a very destructive period as well. But when the contradictions of the system pronounced themselves, finally exploded in this sort of Gaza scenario, they went after to go attack the largest island that represented the strongest contradictions and the strongest resistance to the thing, to try and continue the Nakba and actually complete it, because Gaza actually is the largest of these islands. So Palestinians have always seen it as a colonial project, and by the way, so have the Arabs, and they see that. And from I live in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood here, which is a daily process of feeling that Jerusalem is going, the integrity of the salami is broken slice by slice, by house. There's a Zionist statement, another dunam, another goat, another dunam. Basically, you can do it slowly or fast. And the Arab world very much feels the same. Let's not forget that. I mean, the Zionist movement was building settlements in Egypt when they were there. They had plans to build settlements in Lebanon as well. There's a feeling that that Smotrich spoke on a panel at the beginning of October 7th on a map that said that Israel would take over Jordan. So it's, it's not something. So of course they see themselves in that. But the irony of the situation, to wrap it up, is the fact that Palestinians were their colonial problem and predicament really becomes most pronounced after 48, of course, like when decolonization is actually ascendant amongst other powers. And of course, they are victims of history's victims, or Europe's victims, shall we say. The question of the Jewish question in Europe, which made their question invisible. And that was actually the exchange that happened. Liberalism said, we will accept the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in 48, because what we did to our minority problem to consolidate nationalism in Europe was necessary, and therefore the Palestinians can pay. So they exported the problem to the Palestinians. And there was actually very conscious aspects of this, actually, from the European perspective, particularly the British.
Thank you so much. Mohammed, I want to bring you back in on this question of the boomerang, which is something that you touched on in your intervention. It's something that I found particularly fascinating in the question of the treatment of refugees and migrants in Europe, which in my research, I argue, is actually the first sort of swing, if you will, that leads to this boomerang, which is that this desire to fortify Europe, to build fortress Europe, leading to these unconscionable moral decisions to allow people to die in the Mediterranean Sea, in the forests in Poland, in Finland. It's like the first sign of this coloniality and also the boomerang. And now sort of Gaza being the next phase of that, of a process that's been ongoing for pretty much the last 30 years as Fortress Europe has started to take shape. But I wanted to bring you back on this idea of the boomerang, because Césaire was obviously describing a very specific moment in history. And I want to push you to think prospectively. How do you think this plays out over the next couple of years with some of the concessions that we've been seeing? You've mentioned in the UK, you've mentioned in Germany, we're seeing it in the United States. The way in which the US Congress is contorting itself to maintain, or at the United Nations, you know, where the UN has positioned itself as, the US, sorry, has positioned itself as, you know, the defender of rights. Now we have these images of these Black diplomats as the face of the veto, the anti-Palestinian veto. So I wanted to bring you in and think to reflect a little bit on the what comes, what should we be sort of anticipating?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that's in Césaire's work, and this is a current that exists throughout the 20th century, sorry, and one which I think we should take very seriously, which is that capitalism is also at the same time, and colonialism is a decadent system. Césaire says that there's two questions that Europe's failed to answer. He says it's the colonial question and it's the proletariat question. Now, why are we across the world gravitating towards the cause of Palestine? Of course, there's problems happening all over the world, even in my own country, Sudan, is displacement. Because I think instinctually, many of us understand that if we allow the genocide to take place in Gaza, then we're all next. That there's a turning point. This is what Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, said at COP28. He said, there will be more Gazas if we allow Gaza to happen, okay? So this all ties in many ways. Like even with the discussion that we were just having about the evangelical movement, the question about refugees, the question about all of this stuff. What is on offer right now, and what has been on offer to kind of soothe our brains to not really approach and to confront the crisis that we're in, has been a kind of, you know, what we could call displacement. We have all sorts of anxieties, fears, desires, and etc. We don't know how to deal with them, and then things get displaced. So for example, Europe has had to have this reckoning. It's had to face this reckoning for a very long time. You know, they did their declaration, France, let's talk about France. They did their Declaration of Rights of Man, and this is particularly the context also that Césaire comes from. They declare themselves human. But, you know, I've pulled up the Robin Blackburn, who wrote about the Haitian Revolution. I can't find the thing now, which is typical. But basically, the quote in general says that actually the test for the concept of the man was not done in France, who didn't do anything about slavery. It was in Haiti. Haiti had to confront France. You know, the test on the principle, and this has been so since the Haitian challenge, this has been something that's constantly needed to be displaced. So to give you an example, you know, I'm Netanyahu. I go and I give a speech blaming the Palestinian people for the Holocaust and not Europe, right? Saying that Al-Hajj Husseini is the reason for the Holocaust. You know, I'm allowed to do that, but the reason why I do that is because I'm both telling us a story which justifies our continuous colonial occupation and oppression and dispossession and extermination of the Palestinian people, but I can also tell Europe a story. You don't have to interrogate yourself. You don't have to deal with all of this. That concept from like a psychoanalytical space is called displacement. And the template of displacement historically for 2,000 years in Europe's history has actually, ironically, been anti-Semitism. Again, I'm going to go back to Judith Butler here, because this also kind of, in a way, connects with what we're seeing in Ghana, right? With the criminalization of the LGBT community. The main idea here is that, you know, right here in Europe, people have this lack of sense of being able to see themselves as men or women in many ways. Neoliberalism's completely destroyed the capacity for us to even imagine that we will ever have Fordist households and have nice homes. And so in that sense of crisis of self, the crisis that people have with their own senses of gendered self, they have to displace that onto trans people. They have to displace all of that kinds of anxieties onto trans people. In a society increasingly becoming very comfortable with violence, with letting people drown in the Mediterranean, with hoping people drown in those small boats that are coming to England. In a society like this, you need to still hold on to your sense of liberal self, sense that in fact you can still hold on to the myth of a concept of the human, right? all of these things are tied in that way, in the sense that we're talking about a phantasm, and that phantasm right now, under the point in which this crisis is really about to explode, is on the question of Palestine. Because now, all of a sudden, even Bastion, and this crisis still can't be contained. I mean, we're even hearing of stories in CNN, in the New York Times, where the employees themselves are uneasy with the justification. So even that sense of self, which we saw in the early days, oh, you know, the first thing you come on the media, do you condemn Hamas? Do you can kind of both sidesing it? Even that's not possible anymore. So right now, this is a moment of the concept of a very sense of humanism, which Césaire was one of the first people to confront with its hypocrisy. So the question then becomes is, can we use this as maybe an opportunity to continue to wage that anti-colonial struggle? That's kind of what's going on in the case of South Africa, the case of Namibia, the case of that we're seeing regularly in the ICJ. But okay, one of the things that I pushed back against has been the concept of relativizing. Relativizing, right? This is the accusation they say, that if you compare anything to the crime of the Holocaust, which was obviously one of the worst horrific crimes in human history, then you're relativizing it. And I've actually been trying to push back against the exceptionalizing, because the exceptionalizing tells a soothing story, which isn't true, right? But at the same time, then there's also another lesson that we have to ask ourselves, and this is an even deeper question. In what way, in what the Israeli occupation, in the way that Tawfiq described it in its entirety, in what way are we replicating those within our own nation states and territories? No, where is the animal inside of us, right? Because that also means that we cannot accept it. So what I'm saying is, just as an example, you know, the Indonesian government went up and gave a very eloquent rebuttal against Israeli settler colonialism. And this has been, of course, part of this broader anti-colonial Global South alliance, and incredible. But some of our friends from West Papua have asked their Indonesian government, you've provided the exact legal argument that we could use against you. You know, our Kurdish friends, you know, Erdogan has mobilized thousands of people into the streets for Palestine. Our Kurdish friends have said, you know, a lot of the rhetoric we're seeing from the way that Israelis are treating Palestinians, we've heard from you, right? We've heard from, you know, Turkish society. And so this is, I think, the next challenge for us as well. In addition to, you know, standing for the real humanism, right? And I'm not someone who's, you know, a lot of academics are against this concept of the human, whatever. I'm someone who's fully behind Fanon and Césaire on rescuing the human from Europe. But at the same time, can we rescue the human from ourselves? Yeah. What aspects of Israeli settler colonialism are continuing in our own nation states, and what can we do to really get to the next stage? I think that's going to be the test for the future.
I want to put this question to all of you, and I'm going to give you a moment to reflect while we invite the participants to also, if you have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A. I will read them out. We're not allowing people to ask questions directly because it just makes it easier to manage the flow of the event. But I want to talk about this South-South solidarities a little bit more, because one of the things that you know, Césaire sort of puts us in this dialectic where he is a person who has experienced the colonial education. He's gone all the way to the top, right? He's been in French government. He's seen its contradictions, and he's removing himself from it to analyze it. We are now in a moment whereby we are seeing leaders of the global majority. We've seen the Malaysian president call out the German chancellor while they're standing together at a platform. He did the same with, I believe it was the President Biden, the Malaysian prime minister, went to Washington, D.C., sat next to Joe Biden and called out the occupation of Gaza. The South African foreign minister has been very visible, vocal, active. Brazilian president is persona non grata in Israel. We have seen a remarkable amount of South-South solidarities expressed towards Palestinian people in Gaza. But On some level, though, you still kind of see these appeals to Europe, that when people say things, for example, like no one is talking about X, right? There are millions of people in the global South who are talking about X, but maybe the conversation is not being surfaced by people who hold power in Europe. And so we're still very much, I think, living in a moment whereby the global South, in as much as we are trying to, we're trying to be visible and to be seen, but we're also appealing to Europe, right? To see us, to see our humanity, to recognize our humanity, to protect our humanity, in part because, you know, as Henning said, it's the arms trade that is making some of these violence possible. It's the arms trade that is making some of these oppressions possible. But I want us to reflect a little bit about what post-colonialities, what post-colonial solidarities, what we need to do to strengthen these solidarities and to make them more meaningful and more effective. Those of us who have studied African history know that you know, post-colonial solidarity was a big part of the African independence movement. So what, you know, if you could just reflect a little bit about what would we want to see. Let's end on a note of dreaming and of a note of hopefulness. What kind of South-South solidarities would we want to see that would deliver the kind of humanist, to borrow Mohammed's framing, the kind of new sort of human first politics that we would want to see coming out of this moment of crisis, because it is a moment of crisis. I'm going to pop in to the Q&A. Please, I see people asking if they can sort of jump in on the question. I appreciate your enthusiasm. I welcome it. It's for flow purposes. We're not allowing that. So please do type in your questions. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. If I could go back to my panelists to think about this South-South question. I've invited you to dream, but if you also just want to comment on that particular note. Yosem, can I start with you because you're sitting in Uganda?
I kind of hoped for another minute to think about it. Because I don't really have the answer. I mean, as I was reading and thinking about today's conversation, one of the issues that kept popping up is that Israel always nourished this idea of solidarity with the great to establish itself as kind of part of that world in terms of legitimacy. But it was also, you know, the post-colonial, the kind of colonial, post-colonial politics that remained alive in Israel also remained alive in various parts of the world, unfortunately. And Israel was always also in the position to kind of nourish them. So when African kind of around independence leaders were debating African unity, Israel immediately jumped on the side of those countries who opposed this idea in favor of this kind of national sovereignty concept. Perhaps the only alternative to the concept of nation that spread around the world at the moment of decolonization, which in a sense as much that it was a victor for imperial colonial kind of methods in Israel, it was in other parts of the world. And
oh, we've lost Yotam. Oh, he's back. We lost you for a second.
Yeah, I think that's Ugandan internet. Yeah, maybe that was just the signal for me to finish. There are initiatives and people who think along these lines. They are marginal and their voices are not heard and nobody takes them seriously. But perhaps this is where our potentially hope lies.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Henning.
If I dream for a moment, then I'm not dreaming of South-South solidarity, but of global solidarity. I do think we should not enter the pitfalls of constructing a North-South dichotomy. In times where the South has arrived in terms of destitution, marginalization, and class structures in the North, and the North has arrived in the South in terms of elite appropriation of funds, in the betrayal of the ordinary people, to which already Frantz Fanon highlighted in 1961 when he wrote in the chapter on the pitfalls of national consciousness. I think what we should try is to establish very consciously global solidarity. Because if we want to win the battle, which it is undeniably so, we have to win it by fighting the struggles in each and every society, shoulder to shoulder with sisters and brothers in all parts of the world. So let's not replace global solidarity by South-South solidarity.
Thank you so much for that intervention, Henning. Mohammed, over to you.
Yeah, it's a difficult one for me also. These days has been very difficult, I think, for a lot of us to kind of dream, in a positive way. It's really difficult to see. So in terms of like a positive project, I'm at a loss. These days I'm at a loss. But yeah, I hope I'll be able to dream again soon. Sorry about that's not a great.
Don't apologize. Don't apologize. It is what it is. Thank you for taking up the invitation. Tawfik, I'm gonna come to you.
I will very much echo what Henning said. I mean, and I think it should go without saying. I mean, I think firstly there are some. I mean, what Césaire's commentary is also basically saying, he's acknowledging also to some extent the obviously the fact that there are also victims within the metropole as well, but all this discussion needs to be framed within an understanding of class, in which Césaire himself had a strong notion of course. So and he ends his essay speaking about the need for the revolution of the proletariat. He's as that being the answer in Europe, I don't think there's any need. I'm not into fetishizing South or North or essentializing them in any way. I think there are reasons why Europe and North America, are targeted more, should be targeted more, because their leverage and their construction of this, they're the ones who are implicated. They're the ones who are protecting this, providing the diplomatic, military, financial umbrellas that enable this to happen, both in Palestine in its most pronounced form, but also in many other areas. That doesn't mean they're the biggest, evilest thing, forever or whatnot. I mean, there's bad things that happen in many places and by many people and stuff. So, we have to maintain a class analysis. We have to, but there are certain elements of society and certain geographical areas, as well as certain classes, that sort of have, to some extent, objective interests in fighting, because because things are very much on the line on a very personal level there. So it really comes to the question of, how can we analyze what is the architecture of the power dynamics that enables the oppression in Palestine? How do we understand that in each context, in each locality? What are its weak points? We need to understand that. What are the social forces that exist there? Where might be areas where we can actually intervene. And it's not just a moral, intellectual question, but actually a very practical one. It's people. It's a genocide happening. It's people. You know, we were talking about partisans in Europe against Nazis. Okay, you know, so we need to be very serious about how realistic about what this means for everybody. Now, I'm not making a call to arms per se, but I'm certainly making a moral call to arms about what the situation. But what that looks like in each locality is going to be different, because the architecture of what facilitates what happened in Palestine looks different in each place. But class is an important category there. Historical analysis is an important category there. And, you know, and but this is where I think research, understanding the local context, can play an important role. And then, of course, organization, mobilization, organization, what can realistically be done with social forces and social movements, also recognizing that revolution is not, or social movements is not something that you sit back on Facebook, but it's something that's made in the streets, you know, and we see this. So, and, you know, because it's not going to, social movements have certainly do have big questions nowadays about how to organize, because the ability of capital and technology and modern neoliberal life to fragment and confuse and disorient is very, very powerful, especially when we're going through certain historical transitions, you know, in the North and in the South, whatever that means, you know. And so there's no formula for it, but there is, but we need to keep on testing, and we don't have time. We need to do it. We need to do it fast. You know, we have to internalize the fact that we have to bring the Hague home, in the sense that, like, the fact that we understand that the genocide is happening now and it needs to be stopped. And if we can't wait until later on to determine that, oh, actually it was a genocide or not, because once it's happened, it's over. You know, I mean, so this is something quite important. And I think here an important to sort of maybe just to end on this, I mean, Martin Luther King spoke very clearly about how the bombs in Vietnam explode in our cities at home, you know, and this is part of making the connections between, you know, what happens abroad is also happening locally inside. And that's where the solidarities need to be built on a global level, like Henning mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tawfiq. Thank you to all the panelists. I have received a question in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we are over time. We're not going to be able to answer the question. I just want to make note that there was one participant who did observe there's the linguistic question that needs to be addressed. What do we mean when we say the Holocaust and sort of that exceptionalism? But I think Mohammed sort of covered it in his intervention about how we think about history and how we think about all of these things. I want to end by sort of thanking the panelists. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you so much for your contributions. It was so, as a moderator, it's always good when the people on the panel do the reading. It makes the conversation flow. But this is such an important text, and it's a fiery text, and it's a very thought-provoking text. And I think your engagements have been incredibly illuminating and incredibly grounding, which I think is something that we really need right now. We are in a moment of crisis. We're in a moment of global crisis, and arguably the crisis in Gaza is a symptom of a deeper crisis of morality in international affairs, in global affairs, that we have moved into a period in which so many things that our well-being takes for granted, the idea of who is a human, who deserves rights, how are rights protected, are seemingly up for grabs, and in a way that is being perpetrated. It's a choice that is being made by people who have power to make these shifts without sort of thinking through the consequences of what that looks like, not just in Gaza, which is bad enough, but really on a global scale. Everything is interconnected. All our histories are interconnected. And I think that's something that this panel has really brought to the fore, that history, if not learned from, is bound to be repeated. We are talking about a historical inability to confront the moral limits, the moral silences, and the moral gaps that exist within Western liberalism, and coupled with the power that some of these nations have over trade, politics, militaries, etc., it creates very significant vulnerabilities for everybody, for us who are often victims of violence and political sort of political power machinations, if you will, and also for those who are in the metropole, as we've heard, because of the boomerang effect. It's not just something that's going to happen outside, it's something that's going to have a boomerang effect within those societies as well. And that is by way of wrapping up, saying, you know, let's keep talking to each other, let's keep learning from each other, let's keep dreaming. In my humble opinion, which nobody asked for, but I'm going to take my moderator privilege to share, we have to keep learning from history in order to avoid repeating it. And we have to keep learning from each other to make sure that we are dreaming together about a just, fair, inclusive world. Thank you once again to the panelists. Thank you to IAI for hosting us. Thank you to all our attendees for joining us today, for making the time. I'm going to hand over now to Raga, who is going to close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nanjala, for doing a fine job chairing this this panel, despite the difficulty of the topic. I think you've covered everything. There's very little for me to say, except that we are going to publish this recording, and then we're going to put together a series on the back of this discussion today. So each of the panelists are going to put together a short piece covering on their respective angles or the respective approaches to kind of analyzing the discourse on colonialism as it kind of, you know, unfolds in Gaza. We're going to be publishing these pieces as part of a series. Kindly look out for them at Debate Ideas within the African Arguments website, and follow our latest updates on the through our Twitter handle, Africa. Thank you. Africa International African Institute, but it's called Africa. Thank you. Thank you all, and goodbye.